Well, good morning, everybody. The good-looking Coleman is the one on the right. Right?
Now that depends which side of the room you're looking at, right?
Peter Coleman is joining me from the Australian LNG industry this morning, and Peter has been in the global oil and gas industry for 31 years. He's probably seen more come and go and things that change and market changes and how innovation has changed this industry than most people. He's the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Woodside since 2011. And we're just going to have a conversation this morning that will hopefully lead to a better understanding of a few things in and around the industry. And so basically I want to start out with just sort of talking about challenges and opportunities, Peter. As Canada builds its LNG industry, what are the opportunities we can look forward to, and what are some of the bumps we'll find along the way?
It's a pretty broad question, so let me spend a couple of minutes and we'll just maybe frame where we are in the industry, because what we're going through today is something, unfortunately, that in a resources sector, commodity-based resources sector, you go through these cycles. So today, if we'd had this conference, well, we had this conference last year, we may have been having a different conversation. This year it's all focused on costs. Last year would have been focused on price and market, and of course who can get into that market first. With respect to where are the opportunities, of course, LNG provides a very long-term job-based growth opportunity, and it's a commodity that we believe is going to be highly sought after for a long time to come. So it's at a part of that cycle, that development cycle, whereas the world looks for cleaner and cleaner energy, gas in the form of LNG, which is a transportable energy form in bulk, is going to become more and more competitive. And rather than competing with renewables, we actually see LNG as being very complementary to renewables, because the things where renewables are weak, gas is actually quite strong. You join the two together and you get quite a complementary mix of energy that's being developed. Now, with respect to the challenges and opportunities that Canada has, and BC in particular, the key here is often it's getting started. And the last few years have really been characterized by us trying to understand what is the opportunity. And how does that opportunity then make its way into the marketplace, and how do we develop sustainable developments that are good for not only the project proponents, that are good for government, that are good for communities, and so forth. And it's a juggling act, and you've seen that bit of tension over the last couple of years as one group is going down one particular path, and another group says, hang on, let me catch up, I need to go down this path, and then government's stuck in the middle, then trying to be often all things to all people as we go through this. So the next couple of years, where are we in the cycle? It's really going to be important for us to understand that the longer we're in this particular low price cycle, the less choices we actually end up having. So the choices that are available to us today are still mostly real, and so if we saw price kick off really quickly, I think you'd see companies trying to move forward rapidly on projects. But the longer it goes, the harder it is, and we lose momentum. And so the key opportunity here for us, and I think the key challenge is to ensure that we maintain momentum. It's maintaining the brand of Canada, making sure that it's first and foremost on the minds of buyers, because at the end of the day, buyers are the ones who pick winners. This is still not a fungible commodity in the marketplace. It's not a commodity in which we can make final investment decisions without long-term contracts. Those long-term contracts are backed by buyers. It's ensuring that the buyers see that Canada is a place that they want to ensure that their product is coming from. Those buyers are often government utilities. And so it's maintaining in the eyes and minds of the buyers that Canada is a good place for them to both invest and receive their product from. And then just as importantly for the investors, making sure that BC in particular stays at the top of our list And as we're looking at the projects that we want to make sure move forward in the world, where we want to continue to invest and make sure that momentum is maintained, that BC stays at the top of that list.
So do you see anything that we could do better or that we're not doing that would help us with that challenge, key challenges for the LNG industry in Canada?
Well, it's a good question, because it's always, well, what could we do better? What can't we? I think we can all do something a bit better. So, this is, we shouldn't leave this conference thinking that if government or one group just does one thing, then that's okay. We've found the magic combination to the lock and everything will move on. So, I wouldn't want the group leaving thinking, well, if government just did this, then everything would be okay. If we could just do this with the community and First Nations, then everything would be okay. Or if the developers could do this, then these projects would move. No, we all need to participate and contribute. And I think as we think then about, well, what does it mean? The thematic of the conference has been around global competitiveness. Well, what does that mean? Well, global competitiveness is, there's a cost competitiveness, there's a margin that we need to get into market. But equally, as I mentioned, the types of buyers for these projects want to buy brand. They're happy to pay for brand, they're happy to invest with us through the cycles. So what can we do? I think we can all kind of step back and say, all right, let's be really, really clear about the things that are fundamentally critical to us. What are the things, let's be really clear about that. And if I had a list of 5 things, what are those 5 things that must be done for me as a government, as a community group, as a developer? What are those key things? That's the critical few. That's the hard thing for us to go through, because it means we're going to have to let some other things go. Then there's another list of about 20 things. Often aspirations, desirable things. We call it the old thing, it's the enemy of the really important things are the good things. And so these are good things, but we've just got to let them go. And so in these times, as we go through this part of the cycle, I think it's really important for us all to put a hand up and put a hand on our heart and say, what are those critical things? And then stop messing with the rest. Because we don't have time to mess with the rest. And we don't have the margin in these projects anymore to be spending time on the things that are really not critical to the project. So my challenge to all of us would be, not just to government, let's sit down and really work out what's critical to us. And once we've got that list, then we can have those kind of open, hard, direct conversations about how do we get there.
And that's interesting. As the minister responsible for this file in government, and I've got colleagues all that all touch this ministry, and we're trying to drive through with an agenda over the last 3.5 to 4 years, we get a number of, if we get true consistent criticisms, it's this: you're moving too fast or you're moving too slow. And then the next question is, how come you haven't got it done yet? So, and obviously we know these are very complex and very expensive market-driven projects that take a long-term investment, so it needs long-term cash flow and revenue to go with them. So looking at us from the outside, having been through the Australia perspective, and seeing how Australia did it in their jurisdictions across their country, are we moving fast enough?
Well, yeah, I'd put that back the other way and say the project will go ahead when it's ready. And you'll find different proponents in the project, whether will be ready at different times. But the project won't actually move ahead in a cohesive way until everybody's ready. And so, if one group thinks that they can move ahead of the others, and then they sit there and say, wait, are we ready yet? Then it's not going to happen. And so we need to make sure that as we kind of go to take that hill, that we've got everybody coming along with us and beside us. We need to make sure we take the right hill. Sometimes we fight a battle, but in fact it's the wrong one. And so it keeps us busy for a long period of time, but guys, you've actually fought the wrong battle. And often we fight battles within our own family, so to speak. And the reality is the rest of the world's just watching us and passing us by. And we need to be very mindful about that, that while we get our own house into order, particularly if that is a public conversation, that others are listening and watching the conversations. Those others have choices, and those others are elsewhere in the world, and they're making judgments, whether it's informed or not informed, it doesn't matter. They are starting to form opinions. And it takes a long time, once you've formed an opinion, rightly or wrongly, to actually change that opinion. So I think as we think about the development of the industry here in Canada is, how do we want this industry to be portrayed? Because each part of the world has a different signature to it, so to speak. The way that we think about sovereign risk, the way that we think about working with communities sustainably, the way we think about the cost structure, the way we think about labour and so forth, characterises the investment opportunity that we have. And so we need to think, how do we want BC to look in that list? And I think there are many elements of BC that are very appealing, and there are a number of elements that we need to think about how we can work through those together.
So I think some of the appealing part or unappealing part come from the same thing. We have an appealing resource, but it's a long ways away. So the unappealing thing is we have to move at a distance to get it to the coast to a plant. And having now involved in 2 properties in British Columbia, and looking at us, how do you feel our cost comparisons match up today to other people we're competing with that have operating plants? Obviously, a jurisdiction like your home country, Australia, has already got LNG and operating, and we're just trying to get to being in the game. But how do we compare on timing, cost, efficiencies, and those type of things with regards to the LNG elsewhere in the world?
Well, there's a couple of elements to that. The first one is, where is Australia in our journey? And we can take for granted where we are today, but really they were decisions that were taken 30 years ago. And then the investment decisions that we're starting to see play out today into producing assets are investment decisions that were made 7 or 8 years ago. So as you think about the evolution of the industry in Australia, there are a number of parallels. The remoteness, a nascent industry, some very bold and courageous decisions early on, both on behalf of the project proponents, and certainly my predecessors within Woodside made some very, very bold decisions at the time that we're now enjoying the benefits of as a company. But equally, at that time, the state and federal governments in Australia made some very bold decisions to underwrite infrastructure, for example. That infrastructure has then been privatised, subsequently at fairly handsome profit. But that people couldn't see that when they went into it. They believed in the project. They believed in this part of the resource sector, and they made those very long-term decisions that today, as you come to a city like Perth, has made that city very vibrant and has made it now the centre of the LNG industry in Australia. So they're very long-term decisions. Those decisions have taxation implications, they have community implications and so forth, and we've grown as we've come along the way. So the way that we deal with community these days is vastly different than where we were 30 years ago, and it's just a natural maturing of the relationship. So I think the advantages we have today, we can then apply those learnings to BC and elsewhere. So there are some courageous decisions that need to be made. It's not easy. Nobody ever said it was, but is it worth it? And I think the answer is an unequivocal yes. There's been a huge amount of wealth created. That wealth has been distributed within the community. It means jobs, it means well-paying jobs. People are being educated to the highest levels, and we're now exporting not only our company expertise, but our people expertise globally. So all of those things come into play. The project proponents themselves, of course, this is a relationship business. So as complex as we want to talk about the oil and gas business being globally, at the end of the day, it's a relationship business. It's a little bit different to the hard rock resource sector. This is one that manages risk through joint venture partnering and through sharing of equity across the value chain. And so for us, it's about making sure we have the right partnerships in place, and it's about making sure we have the right relationships with those buyers. So as we think about how this industry will grow, we must think about who is the recipient of the product. At the end of the day, who are the people or the countries that are also going to be inextricably linked in this energy chain for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Now, Canada, of course, has some similar challenges to Australia with remoteness and so forth. I was just reflecting on topography. Most of what we do is offshore, deep water. It really doesn't matter. You just flip that around and that could be onshore going across the mountain range. It's just topography. It's just a challenge that industry knows how to work through. The advantage that Canada has is it's got a well-known resource base. So some of the things that we're often concerned about in the industry before we invest is, do we actually have a resource base? And the thing that really stands out that differentiates Canada from many, many places in the world is you can almost bank the resource for the long term. And so as a buyer, as you're sitting there saying, well, where do I want, if I'm a utility in Asia, and I've got to take a 40-year long-term view, a similar view that maybe some of the hydro investors need to make and so forth, then I can almost bank on Canada because I know the resource base is diverse enough and it has access that allows me to say, at least for 40 years, I'm going to have that resource available to me. The challenge then is how do we develop it cost effectively? And that's my job. We need to get about that and do that.
So while you were talking about that, you mentioned people making courageous decisions, some courageous decisions. Can you give me a couple of examples of what courageous decisions both particularly government might have made back in the days in Australia?
Yeah, well, look, the Australian story is well documented, but maybe not often reflected upon because we take for granted what we have today. I would say the industry in two places, and let's talk about an historic example and maybe a more contemporary example of it. Historically, in Western Australia, the industry was underpinned by a courageous decision by the Premier at the time, a gentleman by the name of Sir Charles Court. And essentially what that allowed was the project, the North West Shelf project, which has been the signature project in Australia now for 25 years, to move ahead based on a development around a domestic gas pipeline. It was unusual. We built the domestic gas system before we built the LNG trains. Often that'll come the other way around. But it was designed that way, and the government built a pipeline, a 1,500-mile pipeline down to a market that, in fact, didn't exist at the time, and displaced other fuel out of the power generation system to allow a market to be created, and then underpinned the take or pay from that particular pipeline. What that allowed to happen, it allowed the project developers to bank a revenue stream. And so it allowed them to bank that revenue stream that then funded the LNG export project over time and allowed the billions of dollars that were required for that LNG export project to move ahead. It's a courageous decision. Government subsequently privatised that pipeline and did quite handsomely out of it. But that wasn't the original intent. The original intent was we've got a remote part of Western Australia. It was undeveloped. We've got a stranded resource. We need to get it to market. We need to be able to provide some certainty for the project proponents. The way to do that is to underpin a market for the particular gas at a particular price. The benefits for the state, of course, were many. Of course, the state took its part of the pie through what's called a state agreement, and a state agreement relates to the onshore site. In Australia, the state does not own the resource because it's outside of the nautical limits because it's in federal waters. But where the state gets control or access to that is through this site agreement that they have. And of course, that gives them then some say in the amount of export quantity and so forth for the LNG, and also gives them a royalty stream. So all of those things came into play. It was quite a complex arrangement, but it required a few parties to get together and be committed to it. The more contemporary example is maybe in Queensland, where you've now got 3 LNG plants being built in Gladstone, and they're in the final phases of starting up, of commissioning and starting up. That's probably an example on the other side where government provided the enabling legislation, it provided the site and so forth in Gladstone so that the plants could be built, but then really left it up to the developers to move forward. There's probably an unfortunate outcome there of lessons learned where you know, as much as companies talk about sharing, if we've got a choice, we don't like to. And so often we do things because we can, not because we should. We do it because we say we can't get on with anybody, not because it makes economic sense. And so what you've got in Gladstone is 3 plants, all built by the same construction company, all using the same technology, all separated by fences. All not sharing infrastructure, all having separate pipelines. So it's a pretty good example there of where maybe we could have taken the learnings of 25 years ago in Western Australia, applied it there and put some expectations in place to say, guys, you need to share. I'm only going to give you 1 pipeline corridor, for example. I'm only going to give you 1 offtake jetty and so forth. I'm only going to give you 1 set of tugs and so forth to work with. Those sorts of things, and it would have forced those conversations that people didn't think they could have.
That might have been an interesting, courageous decision in itself.
Look, it would have been in the context of where Australia likes generally to head on these things. But, you know, it's also tied up at the moment in this kind of domestic gas debate that's happening on the east coast of Australia and whether gas should be reserved or not and so forth and so on. And of course, you know, often decisions are made on a state basis. Some of those things then play out as pipelines and so forth are intertwined and interlinked and so forth, and you're seeing what's good for one state is actually causing gas prices to rise in another state and so forth. And all of that's fine because it's just a competitive nature. It's actually a good thing. So in the short term, you see a little bit of stress occurring within the system. The status quo is disrupted, but that's actually a good thing because that then creates change, and then people are starting to think about, well, actually, how did I get the gas in the first place? And let's go back and think about being competitive. So if I'm a user state rather than a producer state, how do I make sure that I'm competitive? So yeah, they are difficult things. You can imagine if government tried to come in and encourage industry to share, there would have been a lot of noise, advocacy and so forth going on, protecting of positioning, all those sorts of things. I'm sure you haven't seen any of that in BC.
Oh, never.
Never.
No. Everybody just gets along.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They just don't talk to each other. Did you, as your gas industry developed, did you have sort of like what I'll call an aha moment where something changed? We had that happen when governments changed in 2001 here. And it's amazing what an individual who has a vision for where they happen to represent, stepping up can make a change. So it was only 15 years ago that BC only had about 15 years of gas for its customers in North America. And it was a part-time industry. It really was seasonal, maybe 6 months of the year. And we had a cabinet minister from up in the northeast part of our province, a guy named Richard Neufeld, who basically came to government and said, I think if we went deeper and we gave some innovation on our royalty programs and let industry go get innovative, that we have something a lot bigger. And as a result, we have today, you know, because government said, well, let's go try this. Did you have a moment in Australia where that sort of, what we have this resource and it's going along fine, but if we did something different, we could make it world class?
Look, I really think there's an excellent example in the iron ore industry in Australia. It sounds very, very familiar. Back in the 70s, Australia had actually convinced itself that it was going to run out of iron ore at some point in the future, and there was a very limited amount of resource that had been discovered at the time, and in fact, government had export controls on that. Not dissimilar to some of the debate that's happening in the US at the moment around export of condensate. And so there were limitations put on it, and a very similar conversation where someone who was a surveyor within government said, no, the resource is actually much larger. It's actually order of magnitude larger. We're just looking at it the wrong way. We're looking at it with a completely different cost base. The key government did then, the fundamental thing the government did then, is it took away the export limits. It actually stopped trying to preserve a finite resource, because the resource was defined by our knowledge at the time. It was defined by our thinking of what was conventional and how we would develop it. And yes, in fact, if our productivity had stayed where it is, if the technology had stayed where it is, and yes, if we had not explored, then that would have been the resource. And so we often get defined by the way we frame a problem or an opportunity. And what you've seen, of course, with unconventional gas in the lower 48 was we defined the opportunity in a particular way, and we built LNG import terminals because of the way we defined the opportunity. A couple of hurricanes, some people who didn't have much else to work on and would, you know, keep working away, eventually cracked the code. And of course, then the business model changed, and guess what? We are where we are today. And Canada has benefited from that as well. So, you know, you look at it and you say, you know, opportunities are often defined by the framework in which we look at them. And Australia is no different. There's a number of excellent books have been written on the development of the iron ore industry in Australia. And it's gone through different cycles. The last cycle it's gone through was basically the elimination of long-term contracts. So there was an original development cycle where the resource was redefined, fundamentally redefined. That took growth through to the mid-2000s. And then in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, then the long-term contracts were dispensed with. And then it went to a purely liquid spot price, commodity-based price. And then there was another exponential increase in development after that, as it allowed new developers to get into the marketplace and to be able to fund their projects. So there are parallels here in the resource sector that we can think about, and we need to sit back and objectively say, well, what is it that's limited? What's the advantages of BC at the moment? What's our frame in which we're thinking about the opportunity? And then if we changed a couple of things, then how would it look? Now, for us, we actually look at it at the other way, because we often do this kind of bottoms up, and we say, okay, well, if we do everything that we know with all the constraints we have, and then we bring along everything that we must have with these things, then this will be the cost. We often then don't match that up and say, well, okay, well, what's the affordable cost for the buyer? Remember what the buyer's doing. The buyer has a consumer. The buyer has an economy as well. Those economies are not too dissimilar to the ones that we're in. They're market-driven economies. Their role in the world is to source energy at the lowest possible price, make sure it's reliable. If there's a disconnect between what we can deliver it to the market at and what they can afford, then guess what? The gas won't flow. The development won't occur. But what will be guaranteed is they'll go find some energy. They won't go without the energy. Will get competed out of the market either on an equivalent energy basis, or they'll develop another type of energy. So we need to be careful that, you know, we talk often a lot, and I understand yesterday on the panel, we waxed lyrical about gas's place in a low carbon world. I would challenge that premise. I would say gas has to earn its place in a low carbon world. And it needs to continue to earn that place in a low carbon world. It doesn't just happen because we think it's a good thing. It doesn't just happen because we think the CO2 footprint is less and so forth. I'll guarantee you everybody else who has a CO2 footprint that is not as good as gas today is working really, really hard to make it better. And so we can't just sit there and say we will always have advantage in a low carbon world. We've got advantage today. Well, we've got to make sure as we take full advantage of that and move forward and put a bit of distance between ourselves and the competition. And the competition is not just other gas. The competition is other sources of energy.
So one of the things that comes up for us on a regular basis when we're dealing with the LNG industry and being in a jurisdiction that's trying to attract its first FID and move into being part of the world marketplace. And as we look at our competitiveness, we have the gas, we have very competitive royalty programs to offset infrastructure and those sort of things, and things that we've done. The one that continues to come up and often is related back to a comment relative to Australia, and that is the issue of labor. We have been trying to re-engineer our education system, do things in our trades, go out and identify the labor that would be required to build a plant, a pipeline, what type of skills and what numbers of people that would be required. And then we have to put that into a package where we can actually sell it, not just regionally, but nationally, if there's a shortage and a need for additional skilled labor. And I know you had experiences with the labor piece in Australia, and we'd be interested to hear what your advice for us would be as we try and wrestle this sort of risk, I guess. It's certainly always identified as a risk, so I guess wrestle this risk down to being as low as possible.
Yeah. Look, it's a good question because it's an input to the process. But if you have a look at the cost structure, there's a couple of elements to what drives costs. There's a direct labour cost that comes here in Canada, and that direct labour cost then encourages us to make decisions as to how much of what we bring in is modularised, built elsewhere, then put together, or whether we stick build. They're important decisions for us because often labour will drive that productivity, will drive those particular decisions. Equally, then it comes down to infrastructure. What we don't talk about a lot is the cost of the infrastructure. So if you think about where competitive advantage is, it's where that infrastructure element has already been dealt with. Infrastructure meaning getting access to the site, going through the approvals process. Actually building it doesn't take that much time. Once you give me a site, I put a fence around it and I can move stuff in. That's actually the easy part. We've done that a lot of times. The thing that takes, if you think about timeline, the thing that takes a lot is to make sure that we've got all of the prerequisites in place. And these are important prerequisites because they are things that once you've put in place and you make that FID decision, then you don't go back on. So if you haven't taken care of your land agreements and environmental agreements and so forth and so on, if that hasn't been done up front and hasn't been done properly, then you can't do it when you're in the middle of the project. So there's no going back on that. So take the time, get it done right, because that means that once we get access to the site, then we can be very efficient in that. So if you think about it, the first part is let's get that bit up front done right. Let's make sure that as we go through that, we spend the right amount of time to be very clear on what we're going to do, what our expectations and requirements are and so forth. And again, let's get back to the critical things, not the want list. Because we can get caught up on the want list forever and we start negotiating over stuff that at the end of the day we say, gee, if we had our time all over again, we wouldn't have bothered with that. It was important at the time, but now as we've had time to reflect on it and so forth, maybe it wasn't so important. And I think that's our challenge. So there's that first part. The second part then is, as we get into the execution and we say, well, how do we execute this the best way? Labour agreements are interesting things. My challenge, my request would be, don't do what we did. And what we did was we got so caught up in the development cycle that we didn't spend the time up front to develop our labour skills. And so what that meant is we had to import labour from elsewhere in the country. And Canada's got all those examples and we can talk about it. So my plea would be, don't just think the easy thing to do is to go into that bucket where suddenly I've got 737s full of labour coming in every day to help me build my plant site. I'll put an example for you, and I know Fort McMurray is probably not much different to this, and I worked Fort McMurray for a while. These things have local implications as well. And I recall when I first went up to Fort McMurray, they couldn't even employ enough kids to fill the shelves in the supermarket because they were all off out driving trucks in the mine. We had the same issue. We've had the same issue in Australia. When I first arrived back in Australia, we had 737-800s flying into Karratha every week, wow, moving labour. Karratha's a little town of 15,000 people. That's a lot of labour flying around the country that we're having to house in temporary accommodation and work accommodation and move them and so forth. So the cost is not necessarily in the plant. We often talk about tonnes throughput per train, and the actual cost is actually in establishing the site, getting the infrastructure and so forth and so on. And often that cost can be up to 40% of the total cost of the project. It's the getting the people there, it's the housing them, the feeding them, and so forth and so on. And I think the key for us is we've now actually been provided with an opportunity to pause. Because I feel for government and I feel for the communities. When the oil and gas industry finds you, we typically find you in a big way. And suddenly you went from no projects to what, I think it was 16 I counted at one point in time, may have been out there. And as in government, you're not allowed to pick winners, so you've got to work them all. And so it's whoever comes first kind of gets worked on. The reality is now some of those will fall off. And so we're going to have some time now to actually work through the projects that were probably always likely to be the ones that went ahead anyway. And we can say, okay, now let's start to work some of these labour things. And let's make sure that we don't import a problem just because it's nice to have a warm body on a work face. Because you can suddenly then take that productivity of the work face down, and I've seen it as low as 4 hours per day. In a 12-hour workday, productivity is down to less than 4 hours. Well, that has other implications to it as well. And so we just, I think right now we've got an opportunity to think through that. And my plea would be, don't think importing labour, importing meaning within Canada, is going to be the thing that solves this naturally. We're going to have to really think through that. That labour will bring expectations with it about what it's received elsewhere in Canada. And I'll tell you today, if that expectation is Fort McMurray sorts of numbers, then this will not be competitive. The labour structure needs to be one that suits BC. The labour structure needs to be one that's sustainable for BC long term. We need to understand we drive local businesses out of business. When we come in and we bring in high-cost labour, that means our kids are going towards those jobs, and then those kids find it difficult then in the long term to actually, because their house prices have gone up, their expectations around their spendable money has gone up, the expectation for services and support and so forth all goes up, and then suddenly you find the jobs drop off, and where's the money to support those services?
So what would you do differently?
I'd be starting to work on it now. I'd be starting to think right now, how are we going to solve this labour problem, and how are we going to make sure that we've got the right people in the right skills at the right time. And often we in industry get, in some ways, a little lazy when we're working in developed countries that have large labour pools. We don't think through it a lot. If I was going somewhere else in the world where there wasn't a developed labour pool, that'd be the first thing on my list. Absolutely the first thing on my list. How do I develop a labour pool that I can actually bring to this job? So we need to be working through that today. That needs to be part of the project development plans, is how are we going to develop sustainable labour practices here? Because what we don't want to do is leave behind a legacy that's not sustainable. Sure. We don't want to be driving that auto shop out of business because suddenly all these mechanics are off working on my project and earning twice the money.
So the challenge, we've tried to address this, I guess, in some ways. So trying to re-engineer our education system, identify trades. This conference has a very large group of young people down on the floor that are actually going through things like Find Your Fit, look at the trades, the opportunities and things from British Columbia schools that are doing it. But I guess the only question I have as I come through it, because our countries are very similar. We're both very large resource-based countries, vast amount of geography, population spread out. These things, as you said earlier, are quite remote in many cases. And so do you think if you had done it differently, you would have had the capacity for the labor, or would you still had to import labor into?
You know, it's one of these things of the capital system is that we don't control labour as a resource. So, you know, what I've described as an ideal world, and, you know, we're in a situation where, as a company, we've been there and already had an established footprint. A lot of the new developers that have come into Australia are establishing operations. And so, you know, we saw the implications of that ourselves, where we became a preferred place for people to be able to get skilled labour from. And so again, it's a good competitive base. It meant we had to sharpen ourselves up as well as an employer, and we're a better employer today for that. The reality is industry is going to be driven by the demand side of the equation and the opportunity. And so it's really difficult for government to step in and control that. And in Australia, we suddenly ended up with 6 or 7 mega projects underway at the same time in the country, trying to get a labour pool that's a finite labour source in 25 million people. That meant we had to move people a lot. But also I think it's an example to say, okay, well, we know that's a bookend. We know what that looks like if we had that amount of investment and we had to move those people. As we think about in Canada, do we have any analogues to this? And the answer is yes. Yes, we do. We say, okay, well, what did that cause? What were the outcomes of that? And how did that affect the communities and the labour pool? And is that a desirable outcome for us? And if it is, then that's fine. You know, if it's an acceptable outcome, then that's fine. And then it will simply become an economic decision that the proponents will make about whether they can develop. If it's not acceptable, then we've got to look at it and say, well, how do we deal with it? And there's a number of ways of dealing with it. An extreme is to say, I'm going to just resource level here and only X amount of projects are going to get approved at any particular point in time. That's one option. That's generally not one that people want to go to, because then that's people starting to pick winners. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to pick winners in these things, because as often as you try and pick a winner, you'll find you've picked the wrong horse in the race. And that's not a good thing to do. The flip side to that, though, is, you know, through the processes, you can insist that, guys, we need to have a robust plan here. Right, this needs to be a little bit more than superficial, and we need to really think through how we're going to do this. How are we going to get the kids out of the schools? How are we going to get these electrical trades and so forth? Tell me how you're going to deal with the institutions and make sure we've got people coming out. And guess what? You know, it's 4 years until, you know, we start moving dirt or so forth and so on. These investments need to start now. So I need to see these sorts of commitments being made earlier in the process rather than later in the process. And they don't need to start big, but they need to start, because once they start, then they can blossom, and they'll move at their own pace. So the key here is, don't get caught up in thinking that we have insights that we really don't have. The reality is, every time we think we've got the code cracked, we get it wrong. Where are we in the cycle at the moment? We're in a very predictable part of the cycle. We know these things, as long as they go up, they come down. We're in this part of the cycle. The opportunity and the challenge here as we move forward is, the longer we are in a depressed part of the cycle with respect to pricing and that cost hasn't come down at the same pace, and it's not just a labour issue, this is the way we develop also, then we lose momentum. And so there are certain gates or windows that we will go through that these big super tankers, you know, they'll just grind to a halt. And so the challenge for us all is, let's keep momentum going. How do we keep these things ticking along and making sure that we've got a head start when price does start to move or buyers do start to come back into the market? The key here now is not trying to pick winners, but more importantly, keep momentum going. And take the time now to reflect on the choices we've made, the decisions we've made, the demands we've made of ourselves and others, and say, all right, now what's really important to me? And if I can articulate and understand those few critical things that are important to me, then that's what we need to be focusing on over the next period of time so that we can move forward quite quickly into this process.
So momentum in this really comes from working together and making sure you're on top of each one of the files and never guessing who might go ahead or not, because investment changes, markets change, what have you. But from a government perspective, to make sure you put a platform together or fundamentals together to be able to be efficient to keep and attract the investment, and as it evolves, help it get to the finish line.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way. If you think about it in this way, at this point, everybody in the boat needs to be rowing. Okay, when we've got lots of energy, lots of price margin, and so forth. Okay, you can have a couple of people sitting there saying, "Well, don't think I want to row at this point." Sorry, today everyone in the boat needs to row or get out. Right? We cannot be carrying anybody at this point. Equally, on industry, we need to be clear with ourselves and say, let's take options off the table. We need to stop keeping options going just because we can. We need to make hard choices because everybody has limited resources. Government has limited resources, community has limited resources, and so forth. We need to be very honest with ourselves and say, which projects are really going to go? Where do we need to put our efforts? And then everything else was a really good idea at the time, and if the stars had all aligned for us and so forth, yes, it would have been great. But the reality is today, with everything else that's going on, maybe today's not the day for that idea. It's still a good idea, but maybe its time is in the future. And today I need to really work on those that have the best chance, because once I get that infrastructure established, once I get those pipeline corridors established, the cost structure comes down. We all need to get behind the projects that have the best chance of moving forward. And to do that, we all need to be honest with ourselves, industry in particular, and to make sure those projects have the best chance of moving forward. This is not a time of saying, I want to be first just because I can. If my project's not the best project, then all I'm doing is I'm holding back the pack. You know, it's like being in a car race and the guy at the front's slow, right? Sometimes he just needs to move to the side, let the others pass, and then he can slip in the back and slipstream, and his project will get moving and we'll all go. If we block each other, we get in each other's way, we'll lose that momentum that we need.
Well, I think we'll close on that very good advice. Our clock down here is telling us we're done, Peter. It's been a pleasure to sit and have this conversation with you. I had a whole other set of questions about the history of Woodside and all the rest of it, but we're not going to get to that today. But I think what you gave us was of extreme value for us to hear in the room, and for my folks to get an understanding about how in this type of marketplace you maintain momentum and stay focused for success. So thank you for doing this morning.
Thank you. Thanks very much.